tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
I want to move on to the idea of corporate welfare here. And we talked a few weeks back on the show about the slippery slope, which you didn't even need to look that far down the pipeline to see coming. And the implications of the federal and provincial governments bending over backwards to give billions and billions and billions in subsidies to Volkswagen to build an electric vehicle battery plant in St. Thomas, Ontario. Again, I'm sticking with local news today, but there's a bigger picture aspect of it. $13 billion was what we found out Volkswagen was getting. And now you look just a couple hours down the 401 and Stellantis, an auto manufacturer building a plant in Windsor, Ontario, has halted because it wants more money from the federal and provincial governments. And now the great story here, Philippe Francois Champagne, the federal cabinet minister, says Ontario needs to pay its fair share to the company to end the stalemate. So all of a sudden, it is companies shaking down the government at all levels for money, and this is just the way business is done in Canada. Aaron Wudrick is the domestic policy director for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and joins us now. Aaron, it's always good to talk to you. Could we have seen this coming from a mile away, that now every company is just wanting more and more cash now that they've seen how much is coming out of the government taps?
Boy, if only someone could have predicted this, like you and me and a lot of other people who said, I do have to confess though, Andrew, I didn't see the chickens coming home to roost quite this quickly.
No, I thought maybe like years, not weeks.
Yeah, it is really something here. And look, put yourself in Stellantis' shoes, right? What they're doing is perfectly logical, perfectly rational. They're saying, hold on a second. You just gave VW $13 billion. What are we doing here? We can clearly get more. They're clearly prepared to pay more. So now they've stopped constructing their plant. And the thing that the real kicker here, Andrew, is I'm absolutely certain that nobody in the Ford government or Trudeau government, when they were busy trying to, seduce VW with billions of dollars, none of them put any thought into what it would do to Stellantis. None of them put any thought into what it would do to other companies watching and learning how to play the game. So that's the real tragedy here. Is this is a mess entirely of their own making. Now you've got Ford telling the feds to do it, and you've got the feds telling the Ford government to do it. And I'm saying, guys, before you were climbing over each other for a chance to offer the subsidy. Now you're saying, oh, no, it's not my problem. The irony is pretty rich here.
Yeah, and that's the problem. They were just bragging about the $13 billion when I would have seen that as a confession more than a boast. And now, they've decided Volkswagen is the beneficiary. Everyone else should just be satisfied with what they got. But again, if you're a company like this, and basically you're holding jobs over the government's head here, I get it. From a business perspective, it makes sense because free money is better than no money, and they know it's being dished out.
Sure, but that's exactly why these things are dangerous precedents. Once you're a government that hangs a sign in your window saying we will give free money away, what do you think is going to happen to any company, Andrew, that's thinking of coming to Ontario is going to stop at Queen's Park first and hint and say, hey, we were thinking of building this plant here. We might build it somewhere else. What have you got for me? This is the situation that they have created for themselves, and it's just not sustainable. We're going to see how tough they are. You'll recall on the day of the VW announcement, Andrew, the Prime Minister very explicitly said, oh, well, other companies shouldn't expect this. This is a one-off. Well, it's only been a few weeks, and he's about to be tested if he's going to keep his word on that.
Yeah, and I know it's difficult to pull up a metaphorical crystal ball here and see what's going to happen. If you're Stellantis and you've already invested in starting this plant and you already budgeted for it, it stands to reason that if the government were to call their bluff, I would assume they would proceed rather than cut their losses. But you never know. And I think the government may not want this if the Stellantis folks end up having better PR than the government does.
Sure. And, you might be right, but we've seen in the past, automakers that already have plants in Ontario that were up and running play this game and imply that, if we don't get more subsidies, we might have to leave. So it would be nice to see a government try and call their bluff on it for once. Of course, a lot of governments are terrified that their bluff would be called and they'd have to wear it. But if you never call their bluff, from a company standpoint, what have they got to lose by trying to do this all the time?
You had a great piece in the Hub. I think it came out yesterday. I read it this morning, in which you talk about there being smarter ways to strengthen Canada than with corporate welfare. But one of the angles that you discussed here, which I think is important, is how certain jobs can be sentimentalized. And I think, factory jobs are that, because it really is, to a lot of people, this hallmark of a bygone era where everyone in the town works at the same factory, and around that factory there's a sense of community. And I don't think that sentimentalization, for lack of a better term, is worth the $13 billion.
No, and look, there's nothing wrong with, as I write in the piece, of course you should be focused on working class families and communities that have lost their employers. But my argument is that corporate welfare is just creating the illusion of bringing back those old times. It's not real. I mean, these are not companies that have an attachment to the community. They're only coming because they're getting a big subsidy. It's a bit like saying, I've developed this new friendship, when really you just paid someone to be your friend. I mean, that's what's going on here. And I think, particularly for conservatives, they need to be careful that they're not sort of, they're not kidding themselves, because this is not real. These are not real jobs. I mean, if you pay someone to hire you, is that a real job? I mean, that's most people would find that a bit bizarre. But that's exactly what's happening here. And so I think people need to remember that there's a massive cost involved in something that would otherwise just be celebrated as a pure gain to the community.
Yeah, and I think there are examples of that. I mean, Chapman's, the ice cream factory up in Markdale, is a really community-oriented factory. I think the Savage Arms plant, which I toured a couple of years ago up in Peterborough, an American company, but really ingrained in the community. But a lot of these automotive manufacturers, it's not to say that they don't have roots in the community in some ways, but I don't believe for a second that if VW could do things for more cheaply in Seoul, that they wouldn't in a second just shut down overnight and move everything over there, because we've seen these big international conglomerates do that. So they aren't really invested unless the subsidies keep coming.
Sure. And the other thing, when we romanticize the sort of one company town, we have to remember how those stories ended most of the time. They ended very badly, precisely because companies were at the mercy of a single company. I think if you want to build communities that are resilient, that are diversified, you can't have one employer. The goal shouldn't be one big employer. It should be a range of employers, so that you don't sort of have all your eggs in one basket. And so if anything, I mean, we're trying to recreate a situation that made a lot of these communities vulnerable. And that's not something we should aspire to. We should be aspiring to situations where when one company goes out of business, it's not devastating to the whole community. And you do that by having a lot of smaller employers instead of just one big one.
I know your focus, Aaron, is on the policy over the politics of this, but I was wondering if you had any advice on how politicians could actually criticize this when it becomes very difficult, when they have to basically say no to an immediate promise of 2,500 jobs in a particular town. I mean, in the case of the St. Thomas plant, it's in a conservative riding, and I know there was a bit of an awkward encounter there with the local conservative MP Karen Vecchio when she was standing beside Trudeau taking pot shots at Pierre Poilievre for not supporting corporate welfare.
Sure. I mean, well, there's a few things, and you can see that the federal Conservatives have done this by referring it to the parliamentary budget officer. I think that's their way of sort of signaling we're concerned, but they don't want to sort of give
the strongly worded letter approach.
Sure, but they don't want to give the Liberals the clip of them saying that they are against these jobs or things like that, right? But I think one thing that people who want to criticize this can just be honest about is saying, sure, it's going to be good for the people who get those jobs, but let's be honest about the cost. I mean, this is not an ideal situation. We shouldn't have to get jobs this way, and there's a real cost. I mean, there are a million other priorities. There's so many other things Canadians expect their tax dollars to go to, and the $13 billion is not exactly chump change. So there's an opportunity cost here, and you're right, Andrew. Nobody wants to sort of be the Debbie Downer and point out the bad stuff. But somebody needs to do it. Thankfully, I'm not an elected official, so I have no hesitation in calling it out.
Yeah, and I mean, when you look at the math, we looked at the math last time you and I spoke about this on how much it costs per job. But even if you just look at the tax burden, $13 billion divided by 40 million people, that's $325 a person. I mean, that's not an insignificant amount of money that if you were to add, ask like Mike in Canmore or, Joe in wherever about, they'd say, yeah, my family could use that.
Sure, and this is for one plant in one community. I mean, if this is your sort of industrial policy generally, how many times can you afford to do this? In how many communities and how many sectors, right? Yeah. Is it really going to be the one-off? Color me skeptical that this is going to be the last time they do this.
Aaron Wudrick, domestic policy guru over at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Always good to talk to you, Aaron. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks a lot, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.